I'd like to introduce Dr. Jason Knoft. He is a professor in the Department of Biology at St. Louis University and the director of Freshwater Policy Institute at the National Great Rivers Research and Education Center. He holds a Bachelor's of Science and Master's of Science degree in biology from Drexel University and a Ph.D. in biology from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He was a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow in biological informatics at Washington University in St. Louis. Recently, he spent a year serving as a water security analyst in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research in the U.S. Department of State. Dr. Knoft's research focuses on the impacts of human activities on freshwater resources and adaptation strategies to address these issues. This work integrates hydrologic, water quality, and ecological models with global climate model projections and field-based research to address contemporary and future issues related to freshwater system sustainability. These research areas are inherently tied to human, social, and economic systems, which are also aspects of Dr. Knoft's work. His research has been conducted in North America, South America, and Asia, and funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the Nature Conservancy. Recently, Sue Williams and I had the pleasure of having a very fascinating discussion with Dr. Knoft over coffee regarding his work. Please welcome Dr. Knoft to our community here at the Ethical Society.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Carrie, and thanks to everyone for making it on to Zoom today. I really appreciate your attendance. So I'm going to share my screen right now, and we can get started. There we go. Okay, so today what I want to talk to you about is the notion of water security and how we can think about water security in a changing climate. And so what I really want to try and convey is, what I like to think of is the system level nature of water. That, I mean, that water touches pretty much every part of our lives. And, we certainly all have interests in water in one way or another, based on our personal interests. But the important thing is to consider is that, we're all nested within this larger system of users and really trying to understand what we mean by water security and how we can manage water resources in the coming decades is really critical to our success as a society, not to be overly dramatic. But to give you some idea of the outline of what I want to talk about today, the first thing I'm just going to go over just what climate change means to water security. And then I want to talk about what is often referred to as the weaponization of water. And then talk about some examples of conflict related to water. And then looking forward, I'm going to talk about some of the issues we may be seeing in terms of water security in the US, with a particular example on cybersecurity and water infrastructure. And so it's difficult to talk about water and particularly climate change and not sound alarmist, but my goal today is not to alarm, but just to give you a perspective on where we stand in terms of water security, and how just the conservation or responsible management of water has both national and global implications. So to start out talking about water security and climate change, there's a water scientist who's out in California it's referred to, it's called the Pacific Institute, Dr. Peter Gleick. And I was watching him speak once, and he said the amount of water on the planet is stable, but the frequency of the three forms varies based on climate. And I thought this was like a really helpful and succinct way to lead up to the issues that we're dealing with in terms of a changing climate. And so, we've got ice, water, and water vapor, gas, however you want to say it. And the amount of water on the planet isn't really changing. But what's changing is the amount of water that is, represented in ice, in surface and groundwater, and then in basically humidity in the atmosphere. And as our climate changes, those amounts are changing, right? Those ratios are changing. And that's where we're seeing some problems. And moreover, as we heat up the planet, the rate at which we move water through those different forms is also changing. So in some ways, you can think about the water cycle is kind of speeding up because of the input of heat into the system. And so that's really what we need to be thinking about, or one of the things we need to be thinking about as we move forward in the next couple of decades in terms of understanding what water security means to us and how we can successfully manage water, both in the US and beyond, and what the implications of that management are. And so I think it's important to define water security as we get started with the talk today. And there are, there are a variety of different definitions of water security, but I'm going to use one put out by the United Nations. And it's the capacity of a population to safeguard sustainable access to adequate quantities of acceptable quality water for sustaining livelihoods, human well-being, and socioeconomic development, for ensuring protection against waterborne pollution and water-related disasters, and preserving ecosystems in a climate of peace and political stability. And so there are a couple things that are important to note from this definition. The first thing is that water pretty much covers everything, right? We're talking about economic activity, we're talking about human well-being, economic development, protection against disease, and then, preserving ecosystems in a climate of peace and political stability. And so I think we often, there's the notion of preserving peace as, a holistic goal or something that we should shoot for the sake of peace being beneficial, and just comforting, for lack of a better way to put it. But really, the stability of our social systems relies on that peace. And so, beyond just feeling safe, our economic viability, our ability to support infrastructure, our ability to interact on an international stage is all really dependent on there being at least some level of peaceful interaction and dialogue. So nevertheless, the UN estimates that about 1.8 billion people are going to be living in areas of water scarcity by the end of this year. So, as Carrie mentioned in the introduction, I spent a year at the State Department as a water security analyst, and that really influenced the way I think about water security. And I generally now think about it in terms of national security. And when we think about national security, I don't mean that, we're hardening our borders or something like that. Our national security is dependent on political stability, and that political stability is dependent on social stability. And without water security, we lack that social stability, and that is a threat to our national security. So, you've got water security directly tied to national security, because when water resources aren't secure, social stability decreases because people tend to lose faith in the government and become disengaged in democratic processes. And so what you want to think about in this context is that water is our most basic need, right? We can get by without food for a few weeks. We can get by without energy for a few months, but without water, in 24 hours, things, can go badly very quickly and very severely. So water is fundamental. And so human society looks to our government to provide us water. And that is the most fundamental, basic thing that, whether you realize it or not, that's what we look to our government to do. And if we can't get a secure water system, generally what happens in the population is they'll say, well, if our government can't even do this most simple, basic thing, what else can I rely on the government for? Like nothing. They can't give me water. I'm not even gonna expect that they can do anything else for me. And so what happens then is that people become disengaged from the democratic system and democratic processes. And so maintaining things like water security is critical for people to stay engaged with our political systems. And so that's where we make the link between water security and national security. So it really comes down to our democratic process. And it's not even a US issue. I mean, this is a global issue no matter what country you're in. And so, water security feeds to national security, and depending on the state of our national security, that, it's sort of a feedback loop. So if you've got a good, strong national system, then you generally have strong water security and vice versa. So, and this all comes to climate, and we think about this, in a larger notion of climate security. And so, just to give you some idea, I mean, all these things are tied together. So climate, water security, food security, energy security, environmental security, human health, everything's under this one umbrella. And all of it is tied to our social stability or instability, our political stability, and then that's where the national security issue comes into play. So I put together these two maps. You'll see the second one in a second. Maps just to demonstrate what water stress and looks like globally. And so this is an annual estimate of water stress for the past year. And this is from the Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas from the World Resources Institute. And the dark red areas are places where there's been water stress. And by that, all we mean by water stress is they didn't get enough rain, right? Or snow or whatever. It's just the amount input into the system versus what's being taken out. But then you have the notion of water risk. And water risk is a combination of water stress and also the ability of local community government, national government to support the distribution and maintenance, the distribution of water and the maintenance of water infrastructure. And so, you look at areas like, what's a good example? Like if you focus on Spain, right? So Spain had really high water stress in the past year, and particularly in the southern coast of Spain. But if you look over at water risk, you can see it's not quite as dramatic, and particularly in northern Spain and so forth. And you can see up in Germany in that area too. But the idea is that if you're economically viable as a country, you can reduce your water risk even in areas of water stress. And so this really gets to the idea of that if we can manage our water in a way that supports our economic infrastructure, then that sort of creates a more robust resilience to water stress. And so if we look even recently to examples of water disruptions, just to get an idea of how these issues can play out both within countries and globally, back in 2022, and this would have been in the summer and fall of 2022, if you recall this. I mean, I since COVID, everything is a blur to me. Like if you ask me what happened in 2022, I don't remember. Like as far as I'm concerned, the past 4 years have all been the same week. So anyway, we had such low water levels. So for example, in the Yangtze River in China, they had such low water that they literally had to shut down entire cities for almost day lengths. And it's because the water levels in their dams were so low that they couldn't turn the hydropower turbines. And so obviously if you're living in that city and your lights turn off for a day, that's a major problem. But the larger problem is that some of these cities were centers of automotive part production. And so entire automotive plants were shut down that are producing parts. And so it was Volkswagen, I can't remember what the other companies were, but there were severe supply chain disruptions in the automotive industry based on these droughts, which, I just use an example as how water touches different parts of society. In the Mississippi River, I mean, you may all remember this. I mean, the past couple of years, we've seen the lowest water in the Mississippi that we've ever seen. Um, and, obviously, this is concerning, but one of the direct impacts was limited barge traffic up and down the Mississippi. And so literally almost overnight, the cost of shipping grain and soy, corn and soy from Illinois down to Louisiana tripled overnight. And so this is, I mean, this is a water security um, issue impacting agricultural productivity. And frankly, a good chunk of US agriculture is exported globally. So there's like a global ripple of this problem. Um, and then in the Danube the same year, there were extremely low water and they couldn't move ships up and down. And the acute issue here was this was right at the harvest season in Ukraine. And so um, whereas usually grain exports from Ukraine, which is, I think, the second largest wheat producer in the world, second or third largest, or wheat exporter, sorry. They usually got their grain out through the Black Sea, but they couldn't because Russia was blocking them. So they had to go overland. And the idea was they were going to transport the grain across or down the Danube, but the Danube was so low that they couldn't get the grain out easily. And so there are implications here because much of the grain from Ukraine would go to Africa. And if anybody wants to read back into what caused the Arab Spring and disruptions to political systems, it was largely due to low grain. So these ripple effects are, I mean, again, I don't want to be alarmist, but they're really just kind of fascinating. And then in South America in 2019 and 2020, there were extremely low water levels in the Paraná River, which is a major source of soybeans. So they grow a lot of soybeans in South America. So you get these localized issues related to water, but they can have global implications. And so that's really what we're thinking about in terms of water security. So how do we place water security in this broader context and think about water security, particularly in a changing climate? And so here's the challenge we face. And when I say we, I mean largely the scientific community conveying information to policymakers. So the graph I have here on the left is measures of global surface temperature change. And so you can think about this as just a map of, or a graph of warming, right? And so we really started to see the temperature increase, maybe around 1980, depending on where you start drawing lines. But prior to 1980, our climate was referred to as being stationary. And that means from year to year, the climate didn't change. I mean, there'd be variability up and down. So, maybe it'd be a little warmer, a little cooler, year after year. But you could pretty much rely on temperature and rainfall patterns being the same, right? And that's, our agriculture is dependent on that. Our supply chains are dependent on knowing that. But now as climate's changing, we are moving into what's referred to as a non-stationary climate. And so the challenge that we're facing there is that we've really lost much of our ability to use past events to prepare for future climate conditions. And so, we need to start thinking about how we need to prepare to maintain water security in a way that we've never done before. And we have the ability to do this. It's not, a lost cause, but we have to completely rethink the way we deal with water. But more importantly, there are also ramifications to how we think about social systems and how they respond to water changes in water availability. And so as the climate changes, our water supplies become less predictable due to greater year-to-year variability. And so the question then is, what are the implications for perceptions of water security? And so how might society's confidence in the provisioning of water change. And so, you might say like, well, I'm I'm not quite sure if you're, a municipality or a state or a country, you might say, like, I'm not really sure how much water we're going to have this year because last year was so crazy and the year before that was so crazy. And so people start behaving differently in terms of their relationship with water. And so the thing that I'm really interested in is whether or not perceptions of water security are also becoming non-stationary. So whereas, from 1950 to 1960, Egypt may have thought about water security very differently than they have in the past 10 years because of the changing climate. And so the implications with greater variability and uncertainty, people have reduced time to consider options. And so you're presented with this new situation and you think, oh, this is totally different. I have to react quickly. And when you have a shorter amount of time, quite often you make bad decisions. And so that's something we need to think about. And then users tend to deplete a common resource to a greater extent under time pressure, right? So if you know that that resource might be going away quickly, you tend to exploit it more quickly. So this is quite similar to the like cookies on the counter in my house. Like the lower the cookies get, the faster my two kids go at the cookies, and the faster the cookies go away because they're like, oh my God, we may never have cookies again, right? And so that's the challenge. And so then if you lay on top of this, like, I mean, to be clear, the history of water security and we'll say water agreements or water diplomacy has been that decreases in water availability have generally led to cooperation. And that cooperation is because it's such a finite resource and countries or municipalities tend to want to agree and work together on these things so everybody can persist in, more of a peaceful way. But when mechanisms for management and resolution break down, due to uncertainty, then we've got a greater possibility for conflict. And so from a global perspective, we might see this conflict occurring across borders. And so this is just a map of transboundary river basins. And that means this is a river system that crosses a border in some way or another. And I mean, basically what I want you to take from this is pretty much every country in the world has a transboundary water relationship with another country. And similarly, in terms of groundwater, these are our aquifers, which are a hugely important resource. There are huge numbers of transboundary issues here as well. And so, the question then is how do we deal with this in the future, and what are the issues that we may need to think about? And so when we move in that direction, a conservative approach is to think about how might we see the weaponization of water occurring. And when I say weaponization of water, when does water become a weapon and how does water become a weapon? And so we can see this happening, between groups, whether it's within a country or between countries, when there are existing animosities, we have variable environmental conditions, the societal institutions aren't very strong, and there's infrastructure development on one side of the border. Basically, like the upstream country starts holding back water. And again, this can be both within and between countries. So there are a couple of different ways that water security can be threatened through weaponization. And so there can be strategic weaponization, and so that's the use of water to control large or important areas and populations or infrastructure. There's tactical weaponization, and that's the use of water against targets of strictly military value. And then there's coercive weaponization. And so it's the use of water to subjugate through the creation of fear of water supply disruption or contamination. And so, a country or a group or some sort of interest group might use water to damage infrastructure. Um, Again, you could use it against military targets. You can contaminate water supplies. It's a psychological approach. And then you can also use water as an instrument of extortion or incentivization. So, what are some of the examples that we see? And so the notion of the weaponization of water is, you know, has a long history. And so if you're interested in looking at the history of this, the Pacific Institute maintains a website of all the uh, examples of water conflict since, 3,500 or 4,500 years ago. And so if you're into history, it's kind of like it's just a very interesting documentation. And the thing that you want to take from this is that, like what we're dealing with right now is generally speaking is not new, right? So I mean, the issue of water and threats to water security, we are not in a situation that is completely novel. Like the reason for it is novel, but we have the ability to deal with this and come out the other side in a way that's just that's reasonable. But anyway, so about 4,500 years ago, I mean, just to go over a few of these issues or cases, there was the Lagash-Umma border dispute. And so this was a relatively small but largely impactful dispute where the king of Lagash diverted water from Umma. And so Lagash and Umma shared a border. Um, it's sometimes referred to as the Sumerian War. And the king of and this border was a very fertile area, and he diverted water from passing across the border to decrease the agricultural productivity of the area. There was the Peloponnesian War. Spartans poisoned cisterns of Piraeus, the primary source of Athenian water. In 1573, the Dutch intentionally flooded the land around Alkmaar, which is in the northern part of the country. And the idea was they wanted to break the siege of Spanish troops that were invading. This is referred to as the Dutch waterline. In 1938, China flooded the Yellow River to defend against Japanese troops. And even as recently as 2022, Ukraine released water from a dam on the Dnipro River to slow Russian troops. And this was actually very effective. There wasn't, I mean, if you remember lines of Russian tanks that were basically held up as the invasion into Ukraine was going on, some of that was due to intentional flooding by Ukraine to slow troops down, and it was incredibly effective. Um, and then the other thing to note is I mean, the diversity of both approaches of weaponization and the instigators varies quite a bit. And so this is just an example of weaponization in Syria and Iraq. And so the different types of combatants and who's using weaponization. And then on the right is incidents of weaponization in various different categories. And so I really only show this to demonstrate the differences and diversity of approaches of threats to water security that are implemented. And so with this notion of water security and water weaponization, how do we move forward? How do we think about this in the coming years? And so if we're looking at transboundary water sources, and so let's look at aquifers. Or actually, I'm going to hold off on aquifers. I'm going to just give you an idea of what we're thinking about in the future in terms of these transboundary issues in terms of rivers. I'm going to come back to aquifers. But there's this idea of something that's referred to as hydrohegemony. And so what that basically means is that one country or one political faction has some sort of control over the water source, and they don't necessarily use it as a weapon, but it creates a dependency of the downstream community or country on that upstream community. And so one of the major issues that, particularly in the US government, that people get excited about, and not in the fun, excited way, is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is in the highlands of Ethiopia. And so this is right on the border of, well, close to the border of Ethiopia and Egypt, and sort of bordering through Sudan. But the problem here is that there's great concern in Egypt that once they call it the GERD, once the GERD is fully implemented, it's going to have huge implications in terms of water reductions getting to Egypt. And so, the highlands of Ethiopia supply more than 85% of the water that flows into the Nile River. Agricultural lands in Upper Egypt are projected to decrease by almost 30% and nearly 25% in the Delta region. There's huge potential for hydropower loss. And then evaporative losses are significant as well. And by evaporative losses, I mean, if you build a dam, you're just going to lose water evaporating from the lake behind the dam. So the thing that's relatively hopeful about this is that initially, I mean, this was a major source of conflict, but what we've seen recently is that they're moving more towards cooperation and agreement in the region, and sort of the recognition that the need for water cooperation and water security is paramount, particularly in the region. So to be clear, hydrohegemony is not weaponization. It's just sort of control. But we're seeing this in a variety of different areas. And so Turkey's Turkey, their hydropower development in the upper reaches of the Tigris River on the Ilisu Dam. And so I don't know if you can see my pointer, but the Ilisu Dam is right here. The Tigris River flows south. And the concern and the sort of recently is it's been a huge there's been a huge reduction of water making it into Iraq. And so, and in particular to the Mosul Dam. And the Mosul Dam's a major hydroelectric area. So, I mean, just another example of hydrohegemony. Another major concern is China's hydropower program on the Mekong River and its tributaries, which has implications for downstream countries like Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. So there's agricultural implications for reduced water loss in these areas. So, and then in the future, you're probably going to be hearing a lot more about the Tibetan Plateau. So there's a huge, huge water resource for Southeast Asia because of the glaciers and snowpack up there. And so China right now is in the process of building a number of hydropower dams up there. And the idea is, if you can control the Tibetan Plateau, I mean, you effectively control water in the Ganges, the Brahmaputra River, the Irrawaddy, and the Mekong, and to some degree the Yangtze, but that's within China. So this is a major, major concern for the entire stability of Southeast Asia. So how do we deal with this? How do we think about what the next several decades are going to look like? And so some folks in my lab recently were working on this issue in Africa. And so what we wanted to do was say, okay, where are we going to see the most water stressed areas in the coming decades? And so I won't go into the details of it, but basically we looked at groundwater, we looked at how much water is evaporating off the landscape, and then we looked at climate models that predict into the future what water resources are going to look like. And we were able to apply a measure or a quantification of future water stress in particular countries. And so you can see in Northern Africa, which is not particularly surprising, these are going to be extremely water stressed areas. And then what we can do is overlay on that the transboundary aquifers. So these are the groundwater areas. And so we might say, okay, if we're thinking about the next, and I want to be clear, I'm using this as an example of how we manage water and water security in a changing climate. So, we might say, okay, Libya and Egypt, both going to be extremely water stressed. They share an aquifer. They're both using this water. So maybe this is an area where we need to be proactive about how we deal with water agreements and water management, water security. Um, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, the same situation. And so it's this kind of approach that we need to take where we're proactive and saying, okay, where are the hot spots and what do we need to be thinking about? And so this certainly applies to Africa, but it applies to the US as well. So, how can we think about how much water we need in Missouri and Illinois in the Mississippi to move grain versus what Minnesota is thinking about doing in terms of their water needs and what they're pulling out. And so we can't understand this without this projecting into the future of what things might look like. But to bring it to the US, and so really at this point, I've been talking about what I'll say are more natural systems. And that is, what's in our rivers, what's in our aquifers. But what I want to talk about now is our water infrastructure, and particularly in the US. And so if we think about how water can become a weapon, um, you know, one way is to damage infrastructure or threatening to contaminate water supplies. And we in the US, since the country was established, have benefited from our relative isolation. So if you want to come after the US, you have to, significantly cross the Pacific or make a long trip across the Atlantic. But now that most of our infrastructure is um, what we could say is like computer regulated or computer controlled, the ability to remotely disrupt water infrastructure has increased dramatically. And so, if we think about this, when our resources are not secure, we have social stability decreasing and people tend to lose faith in government. And so, how might that happen? And so, what I thought about when I was at the State Department, I still think about are cyber threats to water security. And so in 2021, the FBI, the National Security Agency, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and the EPA put out this joint warning that U.S. water and wastewater systems are being targeted by known and unknown malicious actors. And so the cyber infrastructure were targets. And like just as an example, and there are several examples, but in 2013 in Rye Brook, New York, the Bauman Avenue Dam, which is an unremarkable dam, was targeted by Iranian hackers who gained control of the dam operations, which include the sluice gates, which basically, raise and lower and release water. And so the sluice gates were fortunately offline, and nothing happened, but it was really kind of a wake-up call. And then in Oldsmar, Florida in 2021, hackers attempted to raise the level of lye or sodium hydroxide in the water more than 100 times in the city's water treatment facility. And the only reason that this was prevented is because there was some engineer sitting at his computer working at the water treatment plant who all of a sudden saw this cursor like jumping all over the screen, and he realized something was going on and he disconnected all the systems. And then between 2020 and 2021, there were water treatment facilities compromised in California, Maine, Nevada, and New Jersey. And so this is a common issue. And the way basically it works is that these water treatment plants are controlled by these supervisory control and data acquisition systems, so SCADA. And it's a computer-based control system for supervision of sensors and all the processes. And so basically what you can think about it, how you can think about it is there's like a main computer center, then there's coordinating computers, and then you might have supervisory computers, but then you've got like these level one direct controls. And so these are like the computers sitting on people's desks that then, may influence plant operations in some way or another. And all a hacker has to do is get into one of these computers or one of these supervisory computers or coordinating computers to be able to take control of the system. So it's a very, when I was at the State Department, I heard somebody say that our water infrastructure is our soft underbelly of national security. And so I think it's appropriate. And then if you consider that we've got about 16,000 wastewater treatment plants in the US, um, and each of them effectively operate independently. So there's no overarching cyber protection of our water infrastructure. And so there are literally 16,000. Well, there's a lot of targets, but it's not even in the US. I mean, it's a global issue. But like back in 2000, there was a wastewater treatment plant in Queensland, Australia that was compromised that resulted in raw sewage spilling into rivers. In Israel in 2020, pumping stations and treatment facilities in multiple regions were attacked to increase chlorine levels in drinking water. There was another attack in Israel the same year. In Norway, water treatment facilities were infected with ransomware. And then in 2022 in the UK, hackers gained access to systems that control the levels of chemicals in water. And so, beyond just our drinking water, water is critical to our supply chains, power generation, industry, food, and fisheries. So, I mean, we need to get this right. And so this is an issue of social stability and water security. And so something that we need to sort of move forward in terms of being more proactive about, because, each one of those, I think I have a, if the legitimacy of coming back to this, the legitimacy of government is based on the government's ability to provide basic services. And if the government can't get, these basic services right, we can't expect the government to do anything right. Really, each one of those 16,000 water treatment plants is an opportunity to disrupt social systems, right? And so that's the challenge that we're facing, is that there are so many different places where our water security can be compromised. And that's in the US, but it's a global issue as well. And so I put this little statement at the end here: people who drink bottled water are less engaged in government. Like, it sounds like a kind of a funny thing, but there's this book by Manny Teodoro and others called The Prophets of Distrust. And it's basically about the bottled water industry. And one of the, I mean, it's an interesting book if you're looking for a book that on water, but the thing that I found interesting is that communities that don't trust their water supply, St. Flint, Michigan, or something like that, members of that community tend to drink more bottled water, which is understandable because they don't trust what's coming out of their taps. And at the same time, there's a correlation between the amount of bottled water consumed by a community and the amount of voting done in that community. So more bottled water, less voting. And it's a very loose relationship, but the point that they were trying to make is that there's a sense that when you can't rely on the government, you become disengaged. So, and with all these effectively targets, we get to this point where we need to really think about what water security looks like in, not necessarily a change in climate, but in a change in climate, in a situation where people are less confident year to year about the availability of water resources. So when we think about cyber threats, this is kind of where we're living. Is this instability and disengagement happens, at that intersection of climate uncertainty, water security, and cyber disruptions. So, what I want to convey is that, you often will hear people say, like, well, this is the new normal, and it's really not the new normal. When we have an event like the Mississippi getting really low, it's next year is going to be different. The year after that's going to be different. And the year after that's going to be different. And it's because we're in this non-stationary climate right now. And so, water is likely going to become more of a common limiting factor to our food, energy, and industrial production. And so the need for secure water supplies may increase instances of weaponization. So the uncertainty created by this non-stationary climate not may result, but we need to develop new approaches to water security. And certainly, like, I have to believe that I've raised some concern among some of you with my presentation, and that was not my goal. I think awareness of issues related to water security is fundamentally important. Like, if you don't understand what's going on, then it leads to uh, poor decision making and poor choices. The thing that I think is that we need to be aware of is, this is a challenging time on several fronts. And but let's think about it in terms of water. Um, you know, Greatness is never achieved when things are easy, right? Society is great when we're challenged. That's when innovation occurs. That's when we elevate. That's when we move forward. And so this is certainly, a challenging time. And, you know, as much as, the news doesn't convey this sometimes, or maybe all the time, the innovation going on right now related to water is incredible. Like the ability now to transform, um, seawater to fresh water, so desalination is expanding in ways that like are rapid and mind-blowing. The ability to generate clean energy is, I mean, that will not be stopped because it's now cheaper to make clean energy than it is fossil fuels. And so whether the US is leading in that um, is, that's our choice to make, but it's happening globally. And so that'll trickle out. But I use those two things as an example of how we see innovation moving us forward. And so indeed, as I said before, this is a challenging time. But when we couple awareness with innovation and the potential for innovation, that's when we see these great advances. And so I truly believe we're at this point in society and our history that's an inflection point that once we get past it, we're going to be better off because of it, because we're being challenged right now, and that challenge is going to lead to advances. And so, I want you to think about that. We need to focus on the implications of the uncertainty of water resources, but at the same time, we need to foster and promote the idea of how we adapt to these changes. How do we become resilient? And when I say diplomacy, I mean, how do we work together? How do we, I mean, on both sides of the aisle, if you want to say, it's almost impossible to compromise. People have this feeling like if we compromise, we've lost. And so we need to compromise. We need to be able to talk to people and understand different perspectives and understand that everybody has interests. Everybody goes home at night and is worried about something, and that we need to be able to meet in that middle ground to come up with new ways to foster this sense of water security, for example, in the broader landscape. And so I tend to think that's through awareness, which is largely based on the issue, the reason for the details and the topic of the presentation today. So with that, I just want to acknowledge several people, and it's folks from the State Department and St. Louis University that I've worked with that really helped me formulate some of these ideas and inform me on some of these issues. So with that, I will thank you for your time, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Knouft. We do have some questions in the chat box. I don't know if you can see it.
I can. Yep.
Great. So,
okay. So so why is Angola white? And I'm assuming that is from one of the water stress maps. And if it is, I think it's because there are no data, or there are not enough data. So those measures are taken based on a variety of different variables. And if you don't have one of the variables, you don't have information on one of the variables, you can't put together a full number or a full statistic on it. So it's white. Rainwater harvesting is generally thought of when you set up some sort of very localized system, meaning like on the gutters of your house, for example, where you collect rainwater in some sort of vessel that you can then basically put a lid on so it doesn't evaporate. And so that's rainwater harvesting. So what are the international impacts on water security with the new administration, funding of USAID, et cetera? I don't know. That's hard to say at this juncture. The funding of USAID presumably or the defunding, we'll say, of USAID is dramatic and impactful, and I can't imagine a way that it's not going to be detrimental if it falls out as it seems it will. So the thing with USAID that I don't think people broadly understand is that USAID does good things and helps people, but the thing that is really, in my mind, incredibly important about USAID is it makes people our friends. And USAID doesn't work everywhere, right? But there are people who need help everywhere. USAID's efforts are often targeted in places that facilitate U.S. national security, right? And so, China, for example, has this Belt and Road Initiative, which you may not have heard of, but it's basically China's approach to expanding their footprint globally. And so what they do is they provide economic assistance or infrastructure assistance to various countries around the world. And the idea is that that's sort of tactfully placed to facilitate their interests globally. And so, you think about it as like some sort of check or balance to the Belt and Road Initiative is USAID's efforts globally. And so what USAID does is gives the US a foothold in a particular country and, supports democracy. But at the same time, farmers are going to take a hit on that one because USAID facilitates the distribution of agricultural products, or presumably farmers will take a hit on that. But so that's one of the things that's an issue there. But so yeah, the security issues are probably fairly significant. The initiatives dismantling the federal government is water security at risk within our borders. That's a hard question to answer without knowing how far all of this is going to go. And so, much of our water infrastructure is at the state is regulated and funded at the state level. And so there's not like a federal water department or something like that. And so what's going to happen with our water security within our borders, or within states it's difficult to say, but it sort of depends on how money at the federal level trickles down to the state level, and if it does, at all to impact our water infrastructure. St. Louis, for example, I live in the city, and even out in the county too, our water infrastructure is old, right? And you could imagine, getting federal funds to support our infrastructure, but that's not really how our water systems work in Missouri. We need to, find support for our water infrastructure within our state. And so does dismantling the federal government impact that? It's hard to say, and I don't think we really know at this point. What's the status of desalination technology? It ranges dramatically. And so there are, you could think about massive facilities that, have the goal of providing significant amounts of water to a municipality, so some sort of city. And the real advances we're seeing there are how those plants are powered, in my opinion. So historically, it takes a lot of energy to desalinate water. And so historically, those plants were run by fossil fuel plants generating energy. But now a lot of these new desalination plants are moving toward green energy. And so there's a lot of it's kind of interesting. A good example to me that's really kind of somebody thinking really well about this is that, if you run water across a solar panel or below a solar panel, it'll cool the solar panel and make it more efficient. And so it produces more energy basically per square unit. And so if you can couple the water that's flowing in or out of a desalination plant with the solar panels to provide energy to that plant, you sort of get a dual benefit of getting fresh water, and you also get more efficient green energy production. But at the same time, there's like desalination, like briefcases, or even smaller, where you can, you could get, fresh water, for a small house, in the middle of, on the coast somewhere or something like that. So that I mean, it's just a vast, I would describe it as a vast and growing industry. It's kind of interesting though that we, and the last time I looked at this, I haven't looked at it fairly recently, but it's a good example of the economic benefits that I think we could be doing better at in the US is that, there are companies in Europe, there are companies in the Middle East, certainly China, who are developing desalination technologies that far exceed what we have. And so we're missing out, like we're missing out on an economic opportunity in that way. So anyway, all right. Regarding Trump's orders to release water from the California reservoirs at the wrong season without selling status, how do state and federal authorities coordinate their efforts regarding dams? I don't know. I don't know and it varies regionally. So, I mean, I guess I don't know I can't give you an answer to that. So like in the Colorado River, there are agreements among states on how much water is released and how much water is held back. But like in Maine, for example, many of the dams are within the state. So it can be within a state, it can be between state agreements, but I think it's pretty much site specific, but I'm not really sure. I recently read the book Death and Life of the Great Lakes, and I learned that other states want to divert water out of the Great Lakes to Western states for irrigation. This is likely not, I can't imagine how this would happen because there is an agreement between the US and Canada on managing water in the Great Lakes, and the US or Canada cannot take water from the Great Lakes and move, I think, don't quote me on this exactly, but you can't move water to a municipality that doesn't touch the shoreline of the Great Lakes without permission from both the US and Canada. So, like if the US wanted to divert water to Arizona from the Great Lakes, they would have to get approval from Canada, and that's just not going to happen. So I think it's one of those ideas that people throw out there, and it's like, it's just not, I can't imagine a situation where it's going to happen. It's the same, like a couple of years ago, there was some discussion of moving water from the Mississippi out west. And that's just like, I mean, it's just a non-starter. There's just too much going on that in terms of agreements and the cost that would make it unfeasible. All right, the West in the US has always struggled with water and water rights. Do we need to take care of that first before expanding globally? Yeah, I think this is an important point. It's not a one or the other situation. I mean, I understand your point, and I understand. I think this also translates to people feeling positively about defunding USAID, for example. And so, you'll often say, well, we need to take care of ourselves before we take care of others. I mean, that's sort of a rough way of describing that, but our best interest is to it's in our best interest to help others. And so, we can sort of pull back and put everything into the US and everything into our infrastructure. And we do need help. Like I fully agree with that. Like there are huge holes like within our borders and people that need help and that we need to do a better job of addressing those issues. But it's kind of like if we take a step back from the national stage, it will ultimately harm us in a pretty dramatic way, both economically and in terms of our security. Um, and it's like, it's like taking care of the front of your house while ignoring the back of your house. It might, one part may look really good, but you're really ignoring almost equally important part of what supports you. So, um, but the West is, I'm glad I don't live out West. And Charlene, I saw you saying that you're out West, so I apologize for that, but it's, the water, like we've got a lot of water in the Midwest and that's nice. Um, uh, okay. What are the regulations for building dams if it affects the countries downstream? It depends. It's country to country, and I'm not sure of water agreements. I mean, I feel fairly confident there are countries out there that already have agreements in place about building dams or not building dams. But in other cases, like the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, I mean, the dam was built and Egypt was not excited about the dam being built and the dam was still built. So it's again, like one of the things I always say about dams, or not dams, about water is that it's all place-based. And by that, I mean, if you consider the local climate, the amount of water in the ground, the amount of surface water, the industry in the area, the need for agriculture, how many people are living in an area, is it urban, is it rural, is all these different things. Nowhere is the same. In no place can we say, okay, well, this worked in Albany, New York. This will definitely work in, Lincoln, Nebraska. Like it's just everywhere is different. And so it's very difficult to say, let's apply a blanket policy to water and hope that it works out for everyone because it's just not, I just don't think that is generally a feasible approach to addressing the issue of water security. So it's very difficult. It's a difficult thing to say like this is the rule.
So great. So my follow-up question to that, within the same country, it's somewhat easier, but like you cited, Egypt was not happy. So before building the dams, do the countries get together and come up with an agreement, or
Sometimes, it's generally would be a negotiation, but and again, it depends. Like I'm not. I mean, there are some dams being built in the Tibetan Plateau, and I haven't dug deep into this and don't know the details of these things, but my sense is that there was not a lot of um, alert or input from countries outside of China on the construction of those dams. And in fact, yeah, that's all I can say about that.
it could be used as a weapon?
Sure. Yeah.
Because, I have this water, I'm going to build a dam and forget about all of you downstream, right? So,
Yeah. And generally like that is not the way countries operate. But the concern is,
yeah,
yeah, that as we move forward, that may become more of an issue.
sure. Any more questions? Great. I mean, really, thank you, Dr. Knouft, for really engaging and very informative lecture today. And we really appreciate it. We could give you a big round of applause. You may not be able to hear it all. Uh, and I also want to thank our coordinators for finding him, Sue Williams and Carrie Estes, and great job finding an excellent speaker for us. And
And
all
if anybody would want to contribute, you could always send a donation to TWA if you would like to also support the International Lecture Series. So we usually pass a basket, but with being on Zoom, we aren't able to do that. But we certainly will consider contributions if anybody would like to send those to TWA.
Great. And I also want to thank the audience because this was kind of last minute change. So I hope it worked out better for most people, I would think. Made the decision easy to attend the lecture. So also thank you for all your very interesting and questions. So that added to the discussions quite a bit. So with all of that, I like to conclude the meeting with another round of applause. Thank you, Dr. Knouft. So
Thank you, and I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk with you all, and again that you all were flexible on the Zoom versus in-person meeting.
thank you.
Okay, but take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.